Good afternoon. I'm Alan Lewis, board member for Games for Change. It's a pleasure to be back up here and introduce our next section. It's really hard to follow a Sith Lord. I'm just a kid from Brooklyn, so I'm a little intimidated, but nonetheless, here I am. As the world evolves with AI, one thing remains constant. Every innovation begins with a human being. The future of play is not solely determined by technology, but by the creators, communities, and values behind it. Whether discussing inclusive design, player insights, or data ethics, our next speakers, my colleague Amelia Avery, Senior Manager of Global Inclusion and Impact at Zynga, and Ryan Johnson, founder of Cxmmunity Media, go one step further to examine how lived experiences and human connection influences the worlds we build and the impact the worlds have on our society. Please give a warm welcome. Thank you.
How do I follow Leo? Like, how do you follow that? That was powerful. That was an amazing conversation, and I love the map. I was like, ooh, I need that at home. I needed that before I got divorced, but to be able to feel. But I'm so excited that we are here together to think about the creative process, listening, and also communities, and how we can continue to bring value to the humanistic moment of the creative process, because I think that that is something that has to be a core anchor when we think about designing, when we think about play, when we think about innovation. And the importance of this conversation, it starts with how do we think about reimagining play? And so I want to speak with you, Ryan.
For sure.
Right, and so when you think about, I guess, the creators that you are working with, what are some of the innovations that you're seeing and experiencing throughout the communities and the individuals that you engage with?
Yeah, for sure. And first and foremost, good afternoon, everyone. Just for a little context, my name is Ryan Johnson, the founder and CEO of Cxmmunity Media. We are a media and entertainment company based in Atlanta, Georgia, that's primarily focused on connecting multicultural audiences to brands, gaming studios, and also working with media agencies. So to Amelia's point, we serve about 10,000 content creators that live in our Discord environment, and we're always finding unique ways to leverage innovation, to work with corporate partners, working with gaming studios, to not only create, vibe-based experience, for lack of better words, for Black gamers, but how do we leverage academia, entertainment, media, and first-party data to really create an ecosystem that supports what is becoming mainstream within the gaming space? And just to speak on it a little further, our company's claim to fame about 6-7 years ago, that's crazy, 6-7, I wasn't even thinking about that. 6 to 7 years ago, we started the nation's first esports and video game league for the historically Black colleges and universities in North America. So the HBCU Esports League gave us a very strong platform, and from there we've been building out different opportunities, that align fully with the title, the topic of this panel around leveraging gaming to form human connection, leveraging first-party data to fill the gap and answer some tough questions that have been overlooked in the gaming ecosystem, but most importantly, creating safe spaces for gamers of color to not only compete, but also to get access to careers and also other academic scholarships and brand-related partnerships as well.
Yeah, I think that it's so important because one of the things that we focus on, especially from the inclusion lens, is what voices are being heard and what voices are we missing, and how do we create containers for us to do more listening. And that's essentially for us, in our corporate environment, is functioning through our communities, right? So when we think about the word community, anchor that word, community, and what does it mean to you? I think that that's a core value of what you should be building around, is how are you impacting and elevating your communities? I think the second component to that conversation, and I want to segue into, is new innovations and trends. And then if there are any voices that you feel directly need to be heard that aren't being heard at the moment.
So I would say about 6 years ago, I always like to tell this short story. I went to graduate school to get my master's in sports administration with the intention of becoming an agent, an MBA agent. In the process of in graduate school at Georgia State, we had a few classes at Warner Media, and Studio J, you know, the NBA on TNT studio, was right next to the TBS studio at the time that was broadcasting E-League on Friday nights. And I asked a bunch of questions. I was like, what is happening here? Why is there a video game studio inside of TNT? And at 25 years old, it was the first time that I ever heard that you can work in the video game industry. And it completely reset my life. And I went on this deep dive to answer the question, and did some research through the IGDA and learned back in 2019 that nearly 83% of African American youth were playing video games on a weekly basis. But at the time, only 2% of African Americans represented the workforce in the gaming industry globally. And so for me, that delta made no sense. Between myself, my friends, my family members, all we knew was gaming in and out. And so to your point, it's like, how could we leverage the interests we knew that existed versus the future that we saw coming and build spaces again, IRL, digitally, and then also from an academic lens to provide an avenue for those to lean in.
Right. And I think it's important because when we go back to the voice and who's represented, it's all of the lived experiences, right? It's the lived experiences of the indigenous. It's the lived experiences of those with different, the neurodivergent, right? It's the lived experiences of a variety of individuals that help to create the worlds that we exist in, but also help us to build deeper connection. And I think that that's really important because as we're building, as we're creating worlds, a lot of the element and components that we miss is connection. How do we continue to connect more with each other in these spaces of play as things are evolving, right? We're going to have to find ways to listen to each other, to become much more curious. What do I know about you? What do I need to know? What helps to connect us as individuals? Because there are larger arcs around who we are and our lived experiences that help to build the impact of this industry. One of the things that I did a talk on recently was that our words create worlds. So how do we think about the words and the language that we're using to create and build our futures? In our conversations, Ryan, we have talked about, I think, multiple segments of the voices and how brands are helping to support, new elevations around voice. And so I would love for you to share a little bit of that experience, because I think you just recently did a beautiful drop at DreamCon, working with a beautiful brand. And so how is that navigating some of the conversations as well?
I think from our perspective, we found that there's a problem on both sides of the coin. So from the industry perspective, gaming, a lot of gaming studios, brands, are like, hey, we're going flat. We know our player base and we're trying to understand how to unlock new customers and customer acquisition. On the other side of the coin, you have this entire community of gamers that is basically saying we're unseen, we're unheard, and we're not included, whether that be our hair designs in games and or physically getting booked as creators to be a part of marketing and media rollouts for AAA games or new IP. And so to your point, we found this perfect storm of bringing brands into a space, and what Amelia is referring to is, I'm curious, is anyone here familiar with DreamCon? Not too many. So if we were to say right now that there is a mirror version of Comic-Con that is 95% African American, same size, about 50,000 people, they just sold tickets in Houston, Texas about 2 weeks ago. These are the events that are going on in the gaming and anime ecosystem that are flying under the radar. And so we were very fortunate to work with McDonald's and their agency Publicis to bring about 6 creators and do a massive content campaign to begin shining a light on what's happening in this space. But in the conversations, whether it be with a gaming studio, a brand, or a media agency, what we're recognizing is that the industry doesn't have the data to support the investment. The interest is there, the passion is there. There's a lot of investments that are being made off just pure vibes, right? And it's the right space to show up. I give a lot of credit to Kai Cenat. If Kai Cenat did not have his moment over the last 2 to 3 years, I would highly still be arguing that there would be a conversation, does this ecosystem of community exist? But now that that lid has been broken off, the question becomes, how do we enter into this space authentically? How do we do it in a way that's representative and also doesn't piss the people off that we're ultimately trying to court and engage? And so to your point, we've been able to work with a number of brands from McDonald's to Verizon, Xfinity, Spotify. We do a lot of work with Xbox and Microsoft. And it is over the spectrum of either creating academic programming, where we have a 501c3 foundation where we're doing all of the after-school care programming for the city of Atlanta and Mayor Dickens, all the way to creating scaled out entertainment-based activations where we're a portfolio company within Live Nation, right? So my interest within gaming and working with brands spans across not only just entertainment, but then also academic and education. And we're just in a very unique position where we can work with a number of partners to create unique programming to engage on both sides.
Yeah, and I think that we have a beautiful moment where we have a lot of leverage with the conversations with brands because they are looking for that moment to expand their audiences. And so if we take that conversation, how can we also build that into tools to support more representation in the industry, right? To support growth and education and initiatives, to support training options that are available that are going to help to be funded in collaboration with some of the brands that are passionate about these spaces as well. I think that it would be great for us to kind of pivot back to communities. And if we're thinking about communities, a lot of times we're listening to them and we want to build for them, whether we're building within our fan bases, but how do we collaborate more with them? How do we build more partnership, not just building for them, but building with them?
I think kind of two things. I think one, we always say the same, right, is and not or, right? I think speaking in a room here, we understand that gaming is not the or interest, right? It's and. We like sports, we're into sneakers, we're into travel, we're into culinary. I think once a lot of the industry outside of gaming begins to understand that gamers aren't different, I think we take a huge step forward. Secondarily, I think you said listening. I think listening's one half of it. I think the other half of it is listening, but being willing to like deeply understand. I think a lot of times, even in my personal journeys as an entrepreneur, I say a lot of people listen. I think a lot of people are intentional with their listening, but when it comes to making the investment or securing the partnership, it's like how much intentionality is there. And I think a lot of times there was some frustration because we would think people weren't interested, or maybe we weren't pitching or saying the right words. And I know we'll touch it on a little bit, but did they have access to the right data? And it's like, you know, at the end of the day, these are business decisions, these are investments, people's jobs. How do we tie this to ROI? And I realized in my own conversation that we were missing that data link. But then from a larger macro perspective, when you looked on the open internet, there's not a lot of first-party data on Black and brown audiences, particularly around gamers holistically. So it was a two-part challenge. And so kind of that is, you know, kind of tying in. And I also wanted to ask you too, right? Because we had a very, very similar conversation to this at DreamCon in Houston. And so as a brand that's in the gaming space, you know, I would love for you to share kind of some of, you know, the eye-opening things that you're seeing as you're now being more intentional about introducing Zynga and your brand to these diverse and nuanced audiences.
Yeah, I think elevation of the stories. I think that we have a moment to create a much more elevated lens of players, of who's playing our games, of who's creating our games through our storytelling. And we can do that in a variety of ways, but I think that that gives us leverage around becoming our own set of content creators. I know that in a lot of spaces where people are, you know, a little bit hesitant around the content creation aspect, but how do you build more connection with your audiences? And that's always with content. And so we need to be able to have a larger conversation around our stories and what is the value of our stories and that interconnectedness in those conversations. So when I was at DreamCon, I was talking to players. I was interested in what they were wearing. The costumes, y'all, were amazing. Like, it was such a beautiful, just a joy and space to be within. That was my first time attending that. That was my first time attending DreamCon, but it was amazing to see the level of detail, the level of community, the music, the love in all of the games, from every genre and generation. And I think there's the generational dynamic in there as well, because that shifted quite a bit. I think that previously we thought, or not we, but many others outside of the industry thought that gaming is segmented to a certain demographic and group, and now it's so much broader, and it's so much broader across generations. And so how do we bring that story that builds much more connection, right? I'm gonna shamelessly plug our Awards with Friends. Like, I play it, my mom plays it, my daughter plays it, right? And we continue to compete with each other, but there's a story within that dynamic. And so how do you continue to build around the stories that are available to us in those moments?
Yeah, no, and I think it's, from our side, it's been really interesting to, just have a part in it over the last 7 years. Just kind of rereading the title as we're sitting here over and over again, like Reimagining Play. It was interesting, starting the HBCU Esports League. Myself and my business partner, we're alum from HBCUs, and two things we knew to be true. HBCU students, being former students, we love video games. Collegiate esports was taking off, HBCUs weren't participating. So we're like, how do we create something where we can meet in the middle? And so now, I think, to your point, the players, creators, this duality exists. It's been very interesting to see these young men, young women transition from being the gamers that just played for fun to intentionally now looking to earn scholarship money, intentionally finding their paths to platforms like Games for Change and for GDC. And it was literally the difference of saying, you're now in a league versus you're just playing your friends in the dorm. And so for me, when I look at gaming, I think gaming alongside media are some of the most influential pieces of content that exist in this country. And I think if we do our jobs correctly, being community, not the industry, our North Star is that we'll be the middle ground between BET and IGN, where we'll be entertaining to this next generation when it comes to this content, but we'll also be educating while also engaging this community in a very, very unique way that has not historically been done, especially when you talk about Black-owned media. So it's just finding these continuous through lines to tell stories, not of the creators, but of the indie game studios, of the comic book makers, of the independent film, because where do they go right now in the industry? You basically have IGN and Dexerto, and they do a really, really good job of covering one segment. But when it comes to this other side, this DreamCon, HBCU, Black game developer audience, there's no one that's highlighting this space. And so we're just being extremely intentional of how do we tell stories, how do we build spaces, and then how do we leverage the data holistically to actually build something that is very meaningful for society versus just being a pure entertainment, another entertainment intersection within the community.
Yeah, I think it's amazing because when I think about the university relationships, we partner with 2 universities, and one of the things that I have seen for the past 3 years is students building incredible games. Their minds are so expansive, but they're not just building games for a medium of play. They're building games to solve real-world solutions. They're building games to fight fires and train firefighters. They're building games to focus on empathy. They're building games to highlight the collegiate experience that may be different for different individuals, and how do we support one another in those spaces. And these were college students that were building a game in 24 hours. So what could they do with a little bit more time, with a little bit more investment, with a lot more care and mentorship? And so now they're not just playing the games, they're much more interested. We had 100 students in a conversation at NCAT, and we were just like, we just want you to all come and talk to us about games and a career in gaming. And I think there's also this component and opportunity around representation, right? And being able to know that you are represented in these different environments, in these different structures, and your stories matter, and how you're going to create within those worlds, right? And so, because my experiences aren't your experiences, right? And so I think that you don't have to wear heels. You don't have to put on this blush. You don't have to do this makeup thing, right? And so how does that translate into our real world environments, and how do we build more connection and empathy with each other in understanding that through the world of games? So I think it's important that when we think about reimagining play, there's so much evolution in this space. There's so much for us to continue to build, the worlds that we can continue to build on top of the layers, but it's anchoring it into the creative process, it's anchoring it into our humanity. And that's something that's very important to me when we think about the advancements of technology, is our humanity being elevated in these spaces as well. When we think about the core essence of what makes us more human, and how do we become more observers of that in different spaces? How do we begin to observe more of each other and our humanity when we're within the creative process and translating that? So I think that I really want to talk briefly just into the data component, because as we are creating, as we are listening, as we are building community, the output, right, is always the data. And that's something that we anchor a lot of our relationships on. That's how we anchor a lot of our spend. That's how we understand what we want to do with budgets. So how has the data conversation evolved for you and your organization?
It's been a huge shift. So about 6 weeks ago now, within Community, we officially launched like our cultural intelligence and first-party data solution. So backtracking, as I mentioned, about 6 years ago, we started this collegiate league. We have over 10,000 creators within our Discord. In short, one day I was sitting in my room and I was like, yo, I have nothing but Google, a whole drive of just CSV files of information. One day we compiled it all together and we were very shocked at what it gave us, and what it turned into is one of the first scaled multicultural gaming audience solutions. So to Amelia's point, even as an entrepreneur in the space for the last 7 years, we were going off vibes. We were going off what we knew from our personal stories, from our friends and our family stories, and we were able to turn that into a business. The second phase of this now is actually having a data-driven story with data points that actually support and back everything that we're up on the stage now talking about. It's been very interesting talking to the same people about the same thing, but having a visual graph. Mm-hmm. It somehow advances the conversation significantly. And so that's personally what I'm excited about. Is one of the biggest challenges, I think I may have said this a little earlier, so not to be repetitive, but when you're building in a space that people are outside, like we're on the gaming space, so like we know this ins and out, but when you're selling to those that are non-endemic to the space, it's two uphill battles. You're not going off of data that's familiar, and then you're also selling in an industry that's unfamiliar to an audience as well. So my biggest challenge over the last 1 year is like, how can I make my own life easier? And the first step was, how do we tell a clearer story that's tied to very clear deliverables versus showing up and getting what can be in some spaces considered intangibles. But now just being more strategic, working with partners, instead of just, hey, let's sponsor your event, let's sponsor creators. It's like, no, work with us on your product development. If you're a RPG game, if you're a nuanced game and you're looking for customer acquisition, we can directly tie you to creators in the space that probably aren't on your marketing team's radar as you're launching new games or new IP. And so just being a lot more strategic in our conversation, I've had to reteach myself how to talk about my own business, which has been interesting. But also even in some of the conversations we're having with you all and the things that you're doing with the all access programs, and like, how can we be more intentional in using the data and direct tie into the community to have direct ROI with our partners.
Yeah, and I think about the trajectory of the industry, right? How do we take data to help us inform new talent decisions, mm-hmm. new decisions around what we're going to be investing in as far as partnerships, right? What partnerships do we need to leverage? What partnerships may we need to sunset? Where are we hearing from more of our teammates? A couple initiatives that we have been very active on is that a lot of our partnerships are focused on industry advancement. And so how do we continue to look at that trajectory from a long-term perspective? So that is where Access All Areas was derived from, is that when we think about the life cycle of an individual in a role within gaming, what do they know? And can we follow that? This is Alan. Me and Alan talked about this in depth. He said, can we follow that trajectory from elementary age all the way through collegiate? And what amazing story that we would be able to tell. So I think that from an industry professional, that's one lens. But then if we think about that same trajectory in play, right? What do we learn about our players as they evolve? My daughter is 6 years old. What are we gonna learn about her from 6 years old and playing Avatar World to being 20 years old and playing,
Right.
I'll say Words with Friends again, because you gotta plug the brand. So, or any of our other amazing games that are in our portfolio. So how do we look at that trajectory of the player relationship also, and then build out more components to keep them engaged, to keep them involving while we're building play. Because that is a part of that reimagining process that we want to continue to evolve as we're building with different individuals.
Yeah, and then I think just quickly, touch on that last point. This past weekend, Streamer University just wrapped up, right? And for those that are unfamiliar with Streamer University, this is Kai Cenat's media property now. He treats it like a university. Think of like Big Brother for content creators, for lack of better words. And I think why I wanted to bring this up specifically on this panel, for me even, I'm like, marketers need to understand what's happening or game studios or independent games as it relates now to this parasocial world between gaming, content creation, and live streaming. The playbook's being completely rewritten on how to reach gamers of today's generation. And so just watching Streamer University and watching how a single streamer, the most subscribed on a platform, is now basically building assets who underneath him of the second and third largest tiers of content creators. And like, what does that mean for marketers? If I'm in this space as a game, academic institution, I'm watching how are the brands and academic institutions showing up in Streamer University in 2026, because it is very interesting, it is very compelling, but it's almost completely different than what the industry has done historically to be as successful as it has to date.
Yeah, and I see that as an opportunity, right?
It's huge.
I think that that's an opportunity where we need to think about building with, right, as opposed to building for,
exactly.
Right? And so when we think about what are they saying, what are they learning, what are they responding to, how do we get involved in those spaces to then activate on what's being created with them, so that we're not on the outside looking in, and we have a little bit more, influence isn't the word, but partnership definitely is, right? And I think in a lot of those spaces, we look at how can we influence this? How can we influence this area? But how can we create better partnership in these spaces to be able to understand them, to be better creators, right? To be better innovators in our spaces.
Yeah. And I think to your point, the influence is around creating moments. It's understanding where the value exists and where it needs to be filled. And when I look at the creator ecosystem, you have highly influential people with very large audiences, but in many cases, they may not have access to new titles or to industry events like Games for Change. Their voices want to be heard outside of a computer. And so when I'm looking at this ecosystem, it's the brands have a ton of influence. It's just often they want to apply the influence in the wrong place.
Ooh.
Right? And so it's understanding now where in that value chain does that exist versus where it existed 5, 7, 10 years ago, because it's definitely still a massive need, but it's just reevaluating again based on data, based on listening and understanding how and when and where do we show up in today's age to reach this era of creator and gamer.
I love that. So as we think about, before we bring our conversation to a close, and I hope that everyone has gathered some amazing insight from this conversation, we're building new bridges, right? We're creating as we are going along, because I think that things are shifting and changing. It's kind of, I see it as like things are breaking apart, but we're building new at the same time. And so in that process, how do we continue to have better connection with each other? What is, I guess, maybe one or two thoughts that you would want to share from that landscape?
I think I said it a few times with me. It's like being open to learning new things, being open to understanding that this industry is bigger than what the industry's known over the last 20 to 30 years. I think that's what I'm most excited about is, again, as a young black man at 25 years old that didn't know you could work in the industry, to a few years later being able to speak on these stages has been eye-opening. I'm really now intentional about pouring back. As I mentioned, we have a HBCU esports league, so I have a pipeline of young men and young women that are following behind us. I mean, I have a number of kids that have already graduated that are full-time
nonprofit sector too. Like,
right.
let's not, don't minimize
no.
the amazing work that he is doing. He also has a nonprofit structure, a foundation that is doing incredible work across.
And so it's really cool now. We have an army of recent graduates that have now become entrepreneurs. And so it's been interesting to see this full life cycle of not just building, but like we're hiring our former competitors to work as our vendors at events. and simultaneously being able to work with the city of Atlanta. We do a lot of work with Governor Westmore statewide in Maryland in like introducing technology and game design careers to young Black and brown students. So to Amelia's point, whether it's on the media side and entertainment and we're doing gaming concerts with Live Nation, or we're on our foundation side and we're creating statewide, citywide programming that introduces students to academia and job opportunities, I think I'm excited the fact that we just have a seat at the table and we have our level of influence that we're able to apply. And then for the remainder of this year, being able to have data-driven conversations to really open up the door for everything moving forward.
Yeah, and mine is be more curious. Continue to be more curious. Curious about yourselves, curious about your internal ideas, curious about your challenges and your barriers, but continue to be curious and observe humanity. All right, thank you guys.